Listener discretion is advised. This episode contains detailed discussion of murder, strangulation, and the systemic failures that allowed a killer to operate for decades. It is intended for mature audiences only. In 2018, a man in a California prison cell picked up a pencil and started drawing faces. He was 78 years old. He drew slowly, carefully, detailed pencil portraits of women, their expressions, the particular shape of an eye, a hairstyle from decades ago, the set of a jaw he had not seen since the night he killed the woman it belonged to. He drew dozens of portraits, then more. The FBI collected them and distributed them to the public, released to news outlets, uploaded to websites, printed on flyers and shared across law enforcement networks in states from California to Florida to Ohio. An appeal to the public. Does anyone recognize this woman? Most of the people who saw the portraits did not understand at first what they were looking at. They looked like sketches of missing persons. They looked like portraits of people someone was trying to find. In a sense, they were. But the man who drew them was not searching for these women. He had already found them, decades before, and he was the reason they needed to be found now. His name was Samuel Little. He had killed 93 people, more than any other serial killer in confirmed American history. He remembered almost every face. He had simply, in many cases, never learned the names. And in too many of those cases, neither had anyone else. They seem ordinary. They hold jobs, have families, smile at their neighbors. They're the ones you least suspect. And sometimes, by the time you know what they are, it is already too late. I am Ben. Welcome to Dark Whispers, Serial Killers. Samuel McDowell. Little was born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia. His mother, a sex worker, was largely absent from his life from early childhood. He was raised primarily by his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio, a working-class industrial city on Lake Erie, in a household that, by accounts, provided the structural necessities of childhood without much else. He did not stay in one place for long. By his late teens and into his 20s, Little had adopted the nomadic pattern that would define the rest of his life, moving between cities and states, finding transient work, accumulating a slow-building criminal record in multiple jurisdictions. Shoplifting, fraud, breaking and entering, assault. Nothing that drew sustained investigative attention, nothing that consolidated into a picture. He was large. He stood close to 6 feet tall and had the physique of a man who had spent years in serious athletic training. He had been a competitive amateur boxer from a young age, and the physical development that came with it, particularly the strength in his hands and forearms, would later be identified as central to his method of killing. He was also, by multiple accounts, charming, not in an obvious or theatrical way, in the quieter, more effective way of a man who had spent decades reading people, understanding what they needed, and offering exactly enough of it to get close. These were the tools he used: a body trained to kill, a manner trained to disarm, and a mind that had, at some point in the late 1950s or early 1960s, made a decision about what he was going to do with them. The question of when Samuel Little began killing is one that investigators spent years trying to answer and ultimately could not resolve definitively. What is certain is that by 1971, when he was 31 years old, law enforcement in Lorain, Ohio, had reason to arrest him in connection with the violent assault and death of a woman. The charges were dropped. Insufficient evidence. It was the first of what would become a pattern so consistent it is almost impossible to describe without a creeping recognition of how badly the system failed. Samuel Little was arrested for violence against women, repeatedly, across multiple states, over multiple decades, and the case against him collapsed, or the charges were dropped, or the jury acquitted. Each time, he walked out of a courtroom and into a country that had just handed him back the freedom to continue. In 1982, he was arrested in Pascagoula, Mississippi, in connection with the deaths of 2 young women, Melinda Lepre and Rosie Hill. The case did not result in conviction. Witness issues, evidentiary problems. He left Mississippi and kept going. In 1984, he stood trial in Florida on charges connected to a woman's death. Acquitted. In 1984, he stood trial in California on charges connected to another woman's death. Acquitted. 4 arrests across 3 states in 13 years. Not one conviction. And during this same period, through the early 1980s and into the 1990s, the FBI would later estimate that Little was killing at the highest rate of his criminal life. The acquittals were not interruptions to his killing. They were, in the most brutal sense, endorsements of it. Each time he walked free into a country that had just confirmed, however unintentionally, that the women he was killing were not going to cost him his freedom. He understood that. He had, in fact, counted on it. This is perhaps the most disturbing thing about Samuel Little, and in a case of this magnitude, that is saying something significant. He was not simply a predator who happened to choose vulnerable victims because they were easier to access. He chose his victims with a sophisticated, calculated understanding of systemic inequality and institutional failure. He told investigators later that he knew exactly what he was doing. Not just the killing, the choosing. He chose women he believed America had already decided did not matter. His victims were overwhelmingly black women. Many were involved in sex work, or experiencing homelessness, or struggling with substance addiction. He targeted locations that reflected this: truck stops, motels in economically depressed areas, street-level sex work strolls, bars at the bottom of the economic order. Not because these were simply the women he encountered, because he had understood, with chilling accuracy and presumably over years of observation, that when these women disappeared or were found dead, the institutional response would be inadequate. Disappearances would be noted, but not aggressively investigated. Deaths would be classified as overdoses or accidents, or simply listed as unknown causes with no follow-up. The files would close, the cases would go cold, and he would continue. He was right. For 4 decades, across 16 states, the bodies were found or not found, and the file said overdose, accident, unknown, no suspect, case inactive. He was not smarter than law enforcement. He had understood something deeply broken about it, and he used that understanding as a weapon. His method of killing was manual strangulation. He used his bare hands, those boxing-trained hands, and he would strangle women into unconsciousness before continuing until they were dead. He reportedly described this process to investigators in clinical, detached detail that law enforcement officials found deeply disturbing in its precision. He left no weapons, no ballistics, no knife wounds. In many cases, particularly in the earlier decades when forensic pathology was less advanced, strangulation deaths in women from the communities he targeted were routinely misclassified: an overdose with bruising, a death of uncertain cause, a body found days or weeks later with degraded physical evidence. This was not accidental. Little understood the forensic landscape he was operating in. He understood that strangulation left subtler evidence than other methods. He understood that the bodies of women from marginalized communities received less rigorous forensic examination. He adapted his method to the gaps in the system, the same way he had adapted his victim selection. He was nomadic by design. He moved constantly between states, between cities, between communities. He never settled. He never established the kind of local presence that would allow investigators in any one jurisdiction to see the full picture. Each murder, in each separate state, looked like an isolated incident, if it was classified as murder at all. No single law enforcement agency had visibility into the scope of what was happening. In the pre-digital era, before national DNA databases and connected case management systems, the information that might have assembled the picture of Samuel Little simply never came together. He killed in California, Texas, Florida, Georgia, Ohio, Mississippi, Kentucky, Arizona, Nevada, Louisiana, and more. He killed across 4 decades. And across all that time, in almost every jurisdiction, the official record said, Nothing to see here. The crack in the wall came from an unexpected direction. In 2012, Samuel Little was in Louisville, Kentucky, on drug charges, a relatively minor arrest for a man who had spent decades evading accountability for murder. As had become standard procedure in many American states, a DNA swab was taken as part of the booking process. It was entered into CODIS, the National DNA Database. It returned a match. The DNA linked Little to evidence collected from the bodies of 3 women in Los Angeles: Carol Alford, 41 years old, killed in 1987; Audrey Nelson, 35 years old, killed in 1989; Guadalupe Apodaca, 46 years old, also killed in 1989. All 3 women had been strangled. All 3 cases had gone cold. All 3 women had waited over 20 years for the system to identify the man who had killed them. Little was extradited to California in 2012. After a trial that included DNA evidence and corroborating testimony, he was convicted of all 3 murders. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He was 74 years old. He would never leave prison, and the system at that point still had no idea what it had actually caught. The full scope of what Samuel Little had done only began to emerge after he was already serving life sentences. The revelation came not through forensic technology or investigative breakthroughs, but through a conversation. In 2018, Texas Ranger James Holland, by multiple accounts, one of the most skilled interrogators in American law enforcement, began visiting Little in his cell at California State Prison. Holland had been assigned to investigate a Texas case he believed might be connected to Little. What he found when he sat down across from the old man in the prison cell was something he had not fully anticipated. Little wanted to talk. Holland was an exceptional interrogator in the specific sense that matters most in situations like this. He understood that the goal was not confrontation, but engagement. He treated Little as intelligent, because he was. He treated Little's self-image as an artist seriously, because doing so opened a door. He established a rapport that allowed Little to feel seen, and in feeling seen, Little began to confess. Not 1 murder, not 3, not 20, 93. Over multiple sessions, across months, Little described murders dating back to the 1960s. He gave dates, states, physical descriptions of victims, details of the circumstances of each killing, specifics that could only be known by someone who had been there. He described women he remembered with unnerving clarity, and women whose details had blurred with time. And where the names were gone, he drew the portraits. Pencil drawings of women's faces, some careful and detailed, some rougher but recognizable. Faces from memory, faces he had last seen in the moments of their deaths, dozens of drawings eventually distributed publicly by the FBI with a simple appeal: "Do you know her?" The psychological weight of those portraits, the knowledge of what they represented, is difficult to process. Samuel Little had spent decades carrying these faces in his memory. He had, in the most disturbing possible sense, kept them. Not as trophies in any physical form, as images. As a private gallery of the women he had killed, maintained internally across 40 years. Criminologists who reviewed the case interpreted the portraits as evidence of an obsessive, possessive relationship with his victims, a psychological architecture in which the killings were not simply acts, but experiences he returned to, mentally, long after the fact. The drawing of them was, in some interpretation, a form of that return. The FBI's VICAP unit worked alongside the Texas Rangers to verify Little's confessions against cold case files across multiple states. The work was painstaking. Each claim required cross-referencing the details Little provided: the city, the year, the description of the victim, the circumstances of the killing, against existing records. Where physical evidence still existed, it was re-examined. Where case files could be located, they were pulled. By October of 2019, the FBI confirmed at least 50 of Little's confessions as credible and verified. They made a public announcement. Samuel Little, they stated, was the most prolific confirmed serial killer in United States history. The confirmed number was 50. The claimed number was 93. The gap between those two figures represents an unknown number of women whose cases may never be resolved, either because the physical evidence no longer exists, because the original deaths were never classified as homicides, or because so little was recorded about them at the time that verification is now impossible. Some of the portraits generated responses. A woman's family saw a drawing and recognized a sister, a daughter, a friend who had disappeared years before. Some victims were named. Others remain unidentified. The portraits are still publicly available. The FBI's request remains open. Samuel Little died on December 30, 2020 at California State Prison in Compton, California, of natural causes. He was 80 years old. He died in prison serving multiple life sentences. He had never been released after his arrest in 2012. He left behind a body count that may never be fully confirmed. He left behind portraits of women whose names no one knows. He left behind cold case files in jurisdictions across 16 states that investigators are still working through. He left behind families, in some cases, who spent decades not knowing what had happened to someone they loved, and in some cases still do not. He also left behind something else, a record of how a man can kill 93 people across 4 decades and be stopped. Not by the investigative systems designed to catch people like him, but by a routine DNA swab on a drug charge. A record of what happens when an entire category of women is systematically undervalued by the institutions that are meant to protect them. Samuel Little understood that this gap existed. He built his entire enterprise inside it. The FBI's criminal psychologists and outside analysts who have reviewed the case consistently describe Little as an organized predatory killer, one operating with sustained premeditation and a refined adaptive strategy. His victim selection was not random. His method was not impulsive. His geographic pattern was not coincidence. What made Little unusual among killers of his era, and potentially unique in American criminal history, was the degree to which his methodology was built around a conscious, calculated exploitation of systemic inequality. He was not the only predator to target marginalized women. He was among the very few who left evidence, in his own words, that he understood precisely why that choice provided him cover. In post-arrest discussions, investigators reported that Little expressed awareness, at times explicit awareness, that law enforcement would not prioritize the deaths of Black women from impoverished communities. This was not a rationalization made in hindsight. It was, by his own account, an operating principle. He had identified a gap in the justice system and made it the foundation of his crimes. Texas Ranger James Holland, who spent more time in direct conversation with Little than almost any other investigator, has spoken publicly about the psychological complexity of those sessions. The challenge of engaging with a man who is simultaneously a monster and, in the specific, narrow sense of his criminal operation, extraordinarily intelligent. Establishing genuine rapport was the only way to get Little talking, and that this required treating him as the intelligent human being he was, regardless of what he had done. Little died unrepentant in the conventional sense. He never expressed remorse in any form investigators found credible. He drew the faces of the women he had killed and described their deaths in clinical detail, and appeared to experience something closer to satisfaction than regret in doing so. The sessions with Holland have been described as simultaneously some of the most productive and some of the most disturbing interrogation encounters in recent FBI history. Melinda Lepre was 22 years old. Rosie Hill was around 28. Carol Alford was 41 years old and had lived in South Los Angeles. Audrey Nelson was 35. Guadalupe Apodaca was 46. There are dozens more confirmed victims whose identities are recorded only by location and approximate year. Approximately 1964, rural Georgia. Approximately 1977, Arizona. Approximately 1986, Florida. The portraits in a federal database waiting. These women were killed by Samuel Little. But the conditions that allowed their deaths to go uninvestigated, uncounted, and in some cases unclassified as murders for decades, those conditions were not created by Samuel Little. They preceded him. He simply recognized them and used them. The most devastating thing about this case is not the number 93. It is the knowledge that the number may be higher. That somewhere in the gap between 50 confirmed and 93 claimed, there are women whose deaths have never been properly acknowledged by any institution, who exist in files, if they exist at all, as overdoses or accidents or unknowns. Who have families somewhere who do not know. The portraits are still out there. The FBI's appeal is still open. If you know the face of a woman who disappeared in any state in any decade from the 1960s onward, the database is searchable. The identification effort is ongoing. Samuel Little is dead. The accounting is not finished. I am Ben. Thank you for listening to Dark Whispers, Serial Killers. New episodes every week. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, the scariest monsters are the ones you never suspect.